To help us break down the 2025 headlines on the Pope, politics, and beyond from a truly Catholic perspective, I am joined here in studio by two of my esteemed colleagues. Dr. Matthew Bunson is the Vice President and Editorial Director of EWTN News, and Shannon Mullen is the Editor-in-Chief of the National Catholic Register, a service of EWTN News. Gentlemen, thank you both so much for being here. Let's start off with news that shook the world: Pope Francis's death in April of 2025. Matthew, what will Pope Francis's legacy be?
Yeah, as with any pope, it takes a long time in church history to unpack, to understand fully what the legacy is. We're still debating and unpacking the pontificate of Pope St. John Paul II, who died 20 years ago. But I think one thing that we're already seeing in this pontificate with Pope Leo is the influence of Pope Francis in broadening the gaze of the church toward what Francis always called the periphery, the peripheries, all of the corners of the world, of making sure that everyone in the church is heard, that the poor, the suffering, the forgotten are heard. And I think we're seeing that certainly in Pope Leo, and I think it's going to be one of the lasting legacies of Pope Francis, that and the constant appeal to God's loving mercy. It's a great hallmark for that pontificate, and I think it is going to endure. And with the passing of one pope came the election of a new one. On May 8th, 2025, Pope Leo XIV was elected. Matthew, you were there covering it for EWTN. Can you, in just a few words, recapture that moment when Pope Leo stepped out onto the loggia and the significance of this election? It became obvious from the moment that the announcement was made of Robertum Franciscum Prevost that an American had been elected. A U.S.-born cardinal had just been elected pope. That was itself shattering in terms of precedence. But what we also really, I think, began to appreciate immediately was why he was elected as a successor to Pope Francis, somebody who is going to be in continuity with Pope Francis. He's talked about synodality, he's talked about those peripheries, but someone also who is very much comfortable with himself, somebody who brings the expertise that the church needs at this particular moment. So it was a shock to all of us to have an American elected pope. But then we got to meet him and we got to know him better, and we understand why he is now wearing the shoes of the fisherman. And Shannon, with the election of the first U.S.-born pope, there's a bright new spotlight on U.S.-Vatican relations, and one of the most prominent points of tension right now centers around immigration and the Trump administration's ramping up of immigration enforcement actions. Can you speak to this point of contention right now and how Pope Leo himself has weighed in?
Yeah, well, to your point on Pope Leo, he has weighed in, and we're seeing with Pope Leo these Tuesday night press gaggles, which are so interesting. He's made comments there and in other places as well, really continuing the rhetoric and the messaging of Pope Francis about respecting migrants, about treating people with human dignity, especially the stranger. So, but he's also called for the bishops here in the United States to be more forceful in their statements with the political leaders. And so we saw that as recently as the Bishops' Conference in the fall, where they came out with a very strong statement aimed really with two audiences in mind. One is the migrants themselves, showing solidarity with them. The other was with the Trump administration, although they didn't mention Trump by name in that statement, but just reiterating some sort of bedrock themes of human dignity that are critical. It's a huge issue for the U.S. Church right now. I mean, just underlining that, reports of detained immigrants being denied access to the sacraments. A growing number of bishops have issued mass dispensations for anyone who fears being deported. Shannon, but looking beyond the immigration issue for a moment, are there areas that the bishops are supporting the Trump administration's actions? There's been some common interests, right? One is the defunding of Planned Parenthood, which was something that the bishops can definitely support. They've been calling for it for a long time. That was part of the big, beautiful bill, but only a one-year defunding, which was a bit of a disappointment. The bishops also are opposed to IVF, in vitro fertilization. There was a lot of concern that the Trump administration was going to go whole hog in support of that. What came out from Trump was something a little less than what was feared. So maybe that's a little bit of a victory there.
That being said, how would you describe this political moment for American Catholics right now? Are we being squeezed out of the established political parties in a new way?
Yeah, one of the challenges that Catholics have always had is that we can very often become policy orphans. In other words, every administration is going to push programs and policies and ideas that are contrary to what the Church teaches and what Catholics are expected and want to believe. We saw that certainly with the Biden administration, with very aggressive policies on abortion, on transgender ideology. It's a similar situation with the Trump administration. So every administration is going to have something that Catholics have a problem with, and certainly the U.S. bishops do. It's especially difficult today, though, because of the polarized political climate. And I think the Catholics are divided, like many are in the country, politically. And that then begins to color their view on a lot of other issues and can put Catholics then squarely in opposition or some distance away from the Church teaches. On the issue of immigration, for example, in our recent polling, we found that 54% of Catholic voters support the Trump administration's policy. So that's a kind of a disconnect with the U.S. bishops. We saw something similar with IVF. So Catholics themselves have an obligation to be formed and inform themselves about what the Church teaches, but it's also incumbent on the Church to make sure that we're teaching clearly across the board.
2025, we can't not mention, was also marked by global wars. In Gaza, the Ukraine-Russia war as well. How has Pope Leo used his office to engage with global conflict?
Yeah, in a couple of different ways. He's certainly standing very squarely in the shoes of Pope Francis and the policies of Pope Francis in the sense of supporting all efforts at peace initiatives, meetings, gatherings, and negotiations. We know that the Pope met with Vladimir Zelensky on a number of occasions. We know that he's spoken with Russian leaders trying to solve the Ukrainian situation. Where the Holy See can weigh in diplomatically, it has. But there's the humanitarian side that the Holy See has been especially strong in promoting. So it's a two-track system for Pope Leo. He is, like all of us, hostage to sort of realpolitik. And I think his hope is that the best deals possible can be negotiated. But the Holy See, I know, also stands ready to serve as an observer and a participant in these negotiations.
Shannon, let's talk about some good news, some positive news of 2025, and that is that dioceses across the U.S. have reported a surge in conversions. We've seen this in multiple places. The National Catholic Register did some digging into this. The Diocese of Cleveland saw a 50% increase in converts at Easter time in 2025 compared to the previous year. The Diocese of Winona-Rochester, about a 67% increase, and in San Angelo, Texas, about a 56% uptick. Shannon, what's going on? Are we on the brink of religious revival here in the U.S.?
It certainly sounds like that, and there's better news because a lot of those conversions are young people, right? So that's very countercultural and a really hopeful sign for the Church. One of the things that we're paying close attention to is these Newman centers at secular colleges around the country, which are booming with people coming in to the Church, and it's really something to watch in 2026 for sure.
Absolutely, and of course comes at the close of the National Eucharistic Revival that was happening here. Okay, Matthew, in 2025, the Church also canonized a number of new saints, Carlo Acutis, Pier Giorgio Frassati among them, and St. John Henry Newman was named a Doctor of the Church. Leave us on an uplifting note and how these saints are interceding for us in this new year.
We can be discouraged by the state of the world. We can always be discouraged by the state of the world, but we can also then be encouraged by the fact that God always brings us the saints we need for any particular era. Carlo Acutis in particular, I think, stands as a perfect role model for the young people who are finding their way into the Church. But so too is John Henry Newman, as the 38th Doctor of the Church, somebody who grappled with the challenges of modernity even in his own time, in the last century. But then we can also look at someone like Bartolo Longo, who is one of the last of the saints canonized in this last year. Somebody who had drifted into the occult, who had been a Satanist, who found his way back. He's a great role model for so many in the modern world who are caught up in the isms, who are caught up in the allure of the New Age movement and moving away from Christianity and belief. He found his way home. All of us who fall can do so too. And I think all of these saints are reminders that all of us are called to be saints.
Amen. Matthew Bunson, Shannon Mullen, thank you both for your editorial wisdom this whole year. Appreciate it.
Thank you.